The mule would not leave the graveyard. Not after sunset. Not after the caretaker pulled the lead rope. Not after 3 grown men pushed from behind. The lantern burned low beside the forgotten grave in the east corner, and the mule stood in the November dark and refused to move, and nobody could say why. Then the lantern went out. And the animal walked away immediately. Elias Pruitt had been the caretaker of the Harlan Ridge Cemetery for 11 years. He was 54 years old, a deliberate man who had come to the caretaker's work after a lifetime of farming, hired hand, then small farm, then this, and had found that it suited him in ways that farming had not. It was quiet. The residents made no demands on him. He was largely left to manage his time and his methods according to his own judgment, and he was not a man who welcomed interruption. He had a mule named George. The name had come with the animal. The Milltown man had called him George for reasons he did not share and Elias had not asked, and the name had stuck because it fit, in the way that certain names fit certain animals through no logic that could be articulated. George was a blue roan mule of indeterminate mixed breeding, the kind of animal produced by the logic of working farm genetics, bred for strength and endurance and reasonable disposition, without any ambition toward beauty. He was large, considerably larger than either of the animals that had produced him, and he had the calm self-possession of large working animals that understood their own capabilities and therefore had nothing to prove. George had been with him for 8 years, acquired from a man in the mill town who had used him for hauling and had found him reliable enough to recommend with specific language, dependable, calm, not easily spooked. Elias had found this accurate. George had pulled the maintenance cart through the cemetery for 8 years in all weather and had not once given him a problem that wasn't a problem Elias could understand and address. George became a problem in October of 1887. Elias had been making the evening rounds, the caretaker's last pass of the grounds before locking the gate, which he did every day regardless of weather. It was dusk, going to full dark, and he had the lantern on the cart and was moving along the east fence line when George stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Elias said, "George." George stood. He gave the rope the short pull that meant continue and George did not continue. He looked at the cart, at the wheels, at the ground around them. Nothing. The path was clear. The night was cold and still. He looked where George was looking. The east corner of the cemetery, the older section, where the markers were weathered to the color of the ground and the names on some were no longer legible. George was oriented toward a particular grave in the corner, a modest stone, set slightly apart from the others, listing slightly to the left the way stones listed after decades of frost and thaw. He said, "George. Come on." He said it the way he always said it, the tone he used with George that was not a command in the strict sense but a direction, an indication that the day's work was to continue. George understood this tone. He had understood it for 8 years. George stood and looked at the grave. After several minutes Elias walked around the cart and stood at George's head and looked at the mule and the mule looked at the grave. He put his hand on George's neck. The mule was not trembling, not the fine shiver of an animal in fear, not the stiff alertness of an animal that had hurt a predator. He was still. His breathing was normal. He was not afraid. He was attending to something. Elias said, "All right. What is it?" George said nothing. After several minutes Elias walked over and pushed from behind, which was his method when the mule had decided something for a reason Elias couldn't identify. George stepped forward, took 3 steps, and stopped again, now facing the grave at a shorter distance. Elias gave up. He left the cart and walked home and came back with his neighbor Aldred, and the two of them pulled the lead rope and pushed from behind and accomplished nothing. George was not pulling against them with the braced resistance of a frightened animal. He was simply not going. There was a quality to it that Elias could not name. The mule's attention was on the grave, specifically, in the way an animal's attention was on a thing it had decided required its attention. The lantern burned low. The lantern went out. George walked home without prompting, pulling the cart, his pace normal and his manner unbothered. 8 years of easy partnership, resumed. Elias stood in the dark graveyard and looked at the grave in the east corner. He held the lantern. He looked at the stone. He thought about a mule standing in this spot for 3 weeks with the specific attention of an animal that had decided something required its attention and was not going to be argued out of it. He thought, the mule noticed something I never noticed in 11 years of working this ground. I don't know what it noticed. He said, to no one, what is it? He told himself it was a one-time event. He had been a practical man his entire life and he maintained this about himself even in situations that did not lend themselves to it. He told himself, the mule had an odd evening. Animals had odd evenings. The following night would be ordinary. The following night George stopped at the same place. Elias noted the time, 40 minutes before the lantern burned low enough to go out. He noted the position, the same grave, the east corner, the listing stone. He noted the mule's behavior, not fear, not aggression, not the animal distress he knew how to read in a working animal. Attention. The mule was attending to something. He stood beside George in the November cold and he looked at the grave and he tried to see what the mule was seeing. He saw nothing unusual. By the second evening he had told no one. He had wanted to observe it again before making it a thing that was being observed. He had wanted to see if there was a practical explanation he had missed, something in the ground near the grave, something about the path that made the mule reluctant on that section. He had checked everything he could think of. By the third evening he had stopped expecting the behavior not to happen and had started trying to understand it. He brought Galt, who had been in the valley since before the cemetery was established in its current form and who had the considered opinions of someone who had seen a great many things. Galt looked at the grave and then at the mule and then back at the grave. He said, what do you know about that plot? Elias said, not much. The marker's old. The name is barely legible. Galt said, can you read it? Elias held the lantern up. The stone was sandstone, the lettering worn to ghost depth. He squinted. And said, Harlan. James Harlan. And a date, 1851 or 1861. I can't tell which. The markers settled badly. Galt looked at it for a long time. He said, I've walked past that stone 100 times. Never thought much about it. Why does the mule care? Elias said, that's what I'm trying to understand. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. The first thing Elias noticed was the lantern. He had not thought about it consciously on the first 2 evenings, but on the third evening, watching George's behavior and looking for patterns, he noticed, the mule stopped when the lantern was lit. Not at dusk, not in general darkness, when the lantern was burning. He had not told anyone about the lantern observation yet. He was still in the phase of checking it himself before inviting others to check it. He was a methodical man. He tested this on the 4th evening by arriving before lighting the lantern, leading George through the east corner in the last of the afternoon light. George walked through without stopping. He lit the lantern. 20 feet past the grave, George stopped and turned around. What troubled Elias was not that George stopped. It was that the mule had already turned toward the grave before the lantern's light reached it. Elias stood in the graveyard with the lantern in his hand and the mule turned to face the grave and he thought about what this meant. He walked toward the grave with the lantern. The mule followed at the length of the rope, his attention fixed on the grave, on something near the grave or about the grave that the lantern was illuminating or that the lantern was producing in some way that Elias could not determine. He had been a farmer and then a caretaker and he understood things through observation the way practical men understood things, by looking carefully and methodically, by eliminating possibilities, by accepting what remained. He had spent 8 years walking this ground with a lantern and had never noticed anything unusual about the east corner. He had walked past James Harlan's grave on every evening round for 11 years and had not given it more attention than any other stone. He crouched beside the stone with the lantern and he looked at everything there was to look at. He looked at the stone itself. Sandstone, as most of the older markers were. The face was weathered but not cracked. The lettering had been cut deep enough to survive decades of frost and it was still there, readable if you held the light at the right angle. He held the light at the right angle. The stone. The listing angle. The ground around it, settled, older, undisturbed. The grass, which was thin and gray-brown in the November cold. No unusual features. No recent disturbance. He looked at the lantern's effect on the ground near the grave. The light played across the settled surface in the way lantern light played, the warm moving light that created shadow and depth in things that daylight rendered flat. The grass near the stone cast small shadows. The stone's face showed the ghost lettering more clearly in the angled light. He thought, the mule is responding to what the lantern is doing here. Not to the grave itself but to something the lantern shows or produces. He did not know what. He looked at the grave again in the morning, in daylight, without George and without the lantern. It was an ordinary grave. The stone was weathered, listing, the lettering faint. Grass grew around it the way grass grew around all the old stones. There was nothing unusual. He went to the church records on a Thursday in November and asked to see the burial records for the east corner, specifically the section predating 1870. The burial record for James Harlan showed, interred December 1, 1851. Age at death, 19. Cause, exposure. Notation, found at post. He said to the minister, "What does found at post mean in this context?" The minister, Porter, 2 years in the valley, no memory prior to 1885, didn't know. He said the notation was unusual. He said, "Mrs. Aldred has been here since the 1840s. If anyone remembers, she would." Mrs. Aldred was 83 years old and had the specific authority of someone who had outlived most of the people she could reference. She listened to Elias's account of the mule and the grave and the lantern without interruption, which was her way. She received information fully before she responded to it. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. She said, "James Harlan." She said it the way you said the name of someone you had not thought about in a long time. "I was 16 when he died. He would have been," she counted, 19. Elias said, "The record says exposure. Found at post." She said, "Yes. He was the lantern keeper." Elias looked at her. She said, "You have to understand how things were managed in the early years. This valley was smaller then. The families here had specific practices around the dead that were common to where they came from, and some of those practices didn't survive the generation that had brought them. The cemetery had a night lantern in those years. There was a practice, in some communities, of keeping a lantern burning through the night in the graveyard. Some families believed it kept." She paused. She said, "It's an old practice. It's not common now." James Harlan kept the lantern. He lit it every evening and extinguished it every morning. She said, "He was not from a prominent family. He was from one of the smaller farms on the south end. His father had been a laborer, I think. The work of keeping the lantern would have been," she paused. She said, "It would have been what was available to a boy of that family. The prominent families didn't do that kind of work." He had been doing it for 2 winters. In December of 1851 he lit the lantern and never came home. They found him the next morning, beside the post that held the lantern. The cold had come in very fast the night before, and he had stayed too long, and he didn't make it back. Elias said, "They buried him in the east corner." She said, "Yes, beside the lantern post. The post is gone now, it was removed years later, I don't remember when. But he was buried beside it. That was where he was found." She was quiet. She looked at the fire. "His mother came to me the following spring. She had been to the grave many times over the winter, and she had been the one who asked the church to put the inscription, 'Found at post.' She wanted it recorded. The family left the valley within 2 years. After that, the name faded. The stone faded. The lantern practice wasn't continued. There was nobody left with a reason to tell the story." I hadn't thought about James Harlan in 40 years. People stopped talking about him after his family moved away. By the time anyone thought to tell the story, there was nobody left who had known him. Elias said, "The mule stops at his grave every evening when the lantern is lit." She looked at him. She said, "Animals notice things." He said, "Yes. But what is it noticing?" She said, "I don't know. But James Harlan spent 2 winters lighting that lantern in that corner. If any ground in that cemetery holds the memory of a lamp burning, it's the ground in the east corner." She said it without mysticism, as a practical observation about what 2 years of nightly practice left behind. Elias told the account to the minister and to Galt and to his neighbor Aldred over the following week. Word moved through the valley in the way that unusual things moved, person to person, with the specific care of people passing on something they had not fully accounted for. By the second week of November, several people had come to the cemetery in the evenings to watch. They came with the studied casualness of people who did not want to appear to have come specifically for the mule, And they stood at the gate or along the fence line, and they watched Elias make the evening rounds, and they watched the mule stop at the east corner.